government. But why? Did he resign for breaking the rules, or because of the media circus was just getting too much? Did he jump, or was he pushed? The man has certainly gone, but the questions remain.
You're an embarrassment to the Prime Minister, Mr Blunkett.
The answer to that question was yes. What David Blunkett didn't know when he left home this morning was that Tony Blair had already concluded that he couldn't survive.
Come round this other side.
Political death is a horribly public affair. David Blunkett knew it because he'd been through this once before. This time, though, he knew there would be no coming back. There were no tears now, just quiet resignation to his fate.
I stepped down today precisely to protect the government from diversion from the policies that we're carrying out, from the reforms we're bringing in.
He had, he admitted, broken the ministerial code by failing to seek advice before taking 3 different jobs when he was out of office.
So I am guilty of a mistake, and I am paying the price for it, and I make no bones about saying that that is my fault, and I stand by it.
That still left Tony Blair to face Prime Minister's questions, to explain why he couldn't hold on to a man he consistently defended.
Whatever mistakes my right honourable friend has made, I've always believed and believe now that he's a decent and honourable man who has contributed a great deal to his country, who has overcome immense challenges that frankly would have daunted the rest of us.
And I quite understand why the Prime Minister's judgment in these last few days has been awry. I can entirely sympathise with his desire to cling on to the right honourable gentleman, the member for Sheffield Brightside. Isn't it a fact that he was one of the Prime Minister's last remaining allies in the Cabinet?
If you doubt that hurt, just look at the faces of the Deputy Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
My right honourable friend resigned for the reasons that he gave, that it became impossible for him, frankly, with the frenzy surrounding him and his job, for him to carry on doing that job properly.
So, Anne Alexander, might sound like a silly question, but why exactly did David Blunkett resign?
Well, I'm not absolutely certain that he did resign. It may be that he was actually pushed. I mean, there was so much going on. Every single day there was something new. There was this drip, 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 just like last time. I mean, some people might say that, whether he consulted the right committee, whether he told the right authorities was pretty trivial. But the fact is, people kept coming back at him. He was losing support in the cabinet, also amongst backbenchers. So in the end, I think he had no choice and he had to go.
Mike, do you buy that? Was he pushed?
No, I don't think he was pushed, but having spoken to him and having spoken to Blair about this, I think they both realised the game was up. Blair says explicitly if he'd wanted to stay, he could have stayed, and I'm sorry he went. But it reaches a point where it just makes it extremely difficult. Blunkett, or who is it now? It's John Hutton, has got this enormous agenda this month: pensions, invalidity benefit, housing benefit, child support agency. It's a nightmare month. So if you're getting all this stuff, some of which is valid, you can argue the toss whether Blunkett forgetting to consult a committee which he thought from the chairman's letter didn't require him to consult. There's an ambiguity in the letter. Don't forget, Blunkett is blind. You've got to keep repeating this slowly. He doesn't read letters twice like you and me. Or whether or not he should have done that and this or that. He didn't hide these engagements because most of them were in the register, but what he's shown consistently since this love affair with Kimberly Quinn, as we must call it, is bad judgment. He's kind of slightly lost the plot, and I think at some point you've got to recognise it, and he went.
Sorry, George.
But the important thing was, and Anne mentioned it, was he lost support in the cabinet. He lost support among Labour MPs. I mean, anybody who spoke to Labour MPs in the days before he left would have found that they were appalled, dismayed by what David Blunkett had been doing. I mean, he effectively had a 6-month sabbatical from the cabinet, and he used that basically on a money-making exercise, got involved in buying shares in a company, and it looked as if he was about to enrich his own family. And he was the minister who was in charge of cutting back on incapacity benefit. They were appalled, and I think David Blunkett realised himself that he had lost that key support within his own party, and that's what a minister needs when he's in trouble.
I think you're about to come to the defence.
David Blunkett wants disabled people to go out to work. You could certainly say he's shown a good example, making the money he did. The reason he did it, one of his friends said to me this, we constantly lose sight of the human side of this. I agree. Blunkett messed it up, and he's gone, paid the price, as he said on your film. He did it because his friend said, when you've grown up in poverty and you escape it, you never want to have it happen to your own children. So he wasted these children's inheritance on lawsuits with Mrs. Quinn. This is not to do with politics, but it's what this was about, and he tried to get it back. And, you know, Labour people are uncomfortable with that. George is quite right. A lot of them were. Not all of them, a lot of them.
And let's move this on to Tony Blair. I mean, was his judgment wrong to bring Blunkett back so quickly? Was his judgment wrong to defend him so long in the recent weeks?
It probably was. I mean, I think Tony Blair's one of these people who possibly, because he's really good friends with David Blunkett, probably found it hard to be absolutely honest with him. I mean, he obviously wanted him back. He's a talented politician, you know, and he could do the job. But I think in the end, it's reflected really, really badly on the Prime Minister. I mean, twice in less than a year. I mean, it's incredible. Who would have ever thought when he brought him back that he would do this again? I mean, when he actually came back as Work and Pensions Secretary, you thought, OK, he's really, really going to be careful this time. But he appears to have been just as careless.
One correction, it isn't do it again, it's the same story. It's about the great love of his life, and everything flows from that. So it's not again, it's part of the same thing.
Well, no, but it was what he was doing when he was out of government. And I think you're right, Tony Blair's judgment. It was quite clear David Blunkett, I think, needed longer to sort himself out. He'd had a huge trauma, and if you compare the way, or the composed way he resigned in his statement when he actually resigned for the second time, with the first time when he was virtually in tears talking about that little lad, I don't think he's got over it. I mean, I agree with Michael. I don't think he's got over it.
No, that's right.
Tony Blair did him a disservice by not giving him longer time outside the cabinet to sort himself out.
That's a kinder way of putting it.
One
I would go along with that.
in all of
Thank
this.
goodness newspaper editors know how to behave.
Indeed. Let's move on quickly. One subplot of this has been the role of Sir Gus O'Donnell, the Cabinet Secretary. Have we seen a civil service sort of reasserting itself, or is it just the head of the civil service saying, look, I'm going to be proactive in these kind of things? Well,
it was quite clear when Gus O'Donnell, he did write a letter making quite clear that David Blunkett had breached the guidelines, and it was not just Gus O'Donnell, it was the chairman of the Committee on Standards in Public Life. He made quite clear that the guidelines have been breached. I think you did see, in a way, the mandarins trying to reassert their authority. They feel they've been pushed around by New Labour and the political appointees, and yes, I think it was a reassertion of their authority.
And what about the status now of the Ministerial Code of Conduct? On one hand,
quite good, I'd have thought, at the end of this week.
I mean, the Prime Minister said in Prime Minister's Questions, now people are expected to abide by this. He almost sort of established a new rule and firmed it up a bit.
Well, they were expected to abide by it. The fact is that the critical fellow here is not the old gentleman George cited, but Gus O'Donnell. He's the new Cabinet Secretary, and in the last two Cabinet Secretaries, actually the last most in my lifetime, have actually not been very effective at standing up to tough Prime Ministers, by which I mainly mean Margaret Thatcher, but also Blair. And as we know, Blair has a reputation for being a bit cavalier about procedure and process. It got him into trouble over Iraq. Now, O'Donnell's in an interesting position. He's a technical economist from the Treasury who became John Major's press secretary. All the squalor, all the tabloids, all the business of the sleaze era at number 10. Why? Because Major went from number 11 to number 10 and took this nice, unassuming, modest man whose picture you don't see in the newspapers with him. And Gus is, clearly going to be a bit puritanical and going to say, up with this we will not put. So good, we want that. Hold them to account.
Excellent. We'll move on from Puritanism in Whitehall, because as if the departure of David Blunkett was not enough, Tony Blair also this week suffered a mauling in the House of Commons at the other end of the road. His majority was cut to 1 as MPs from all sides tore into his anti-terror laws. So are the once dormant Labour backbenchers finally waking up? And if so, what does it mean for the Prime Minister's even more controversial public service reforms?
Daunted by the new job, John?
Undaunted, the new Work and Pensions Secretary arrives at Cabinet. John Hutton, not the only one facing potential flack. After a near defeat in the Commons on anti-terror laws and the resignation of David Blunkett, the task for Tony Blair today to persuade ministers that he's still in charge. Labour MPs are restless, speculating that the Prime Minister's losing his grip. The message from government, though, business as usual.
I can tell you the Prime Minister's authority most certainly is not ebbing away. The one thing that the Prime Minister has not done is duck away from any of these difficult issues, whether it be education, whether it be terrorism, whether it be health. He's absolutely determined, as is the government, to deliver.
That's not a widely shared view, either on Fleet Street or at Westminster.
We are seeing a Prime Minister who
whose authority has gone. And that is very bad for the country. The country faces serious problems which need to be tackled by a government with authority.
So what are backbenchers saying on terror?
If the government insists on 90 days or anything like it, I won't be voting for it, I shall be voting against.
On schools.
I think if the current education proposals come through without amendment, then there will be real difficulty in getting some Labour MPs to support them.
And on welfare.
If they come forward with an agenda that's actually punitive and says we're cutting individuals' benefits in order to draconian measures, if you like, to force people to do things, that will not go down well and there will be a big scrap.
Michael White, on the terror bill specifically initially, did the government were they surprised by the scale of the opposition? Did it catch them unawares?
No, I don't think so. They've got not much experience of dealing with smaller majorities because, like Margaret Thatcher before them, they've had a couple of big ones. So they were braced for this, and you never know how far it'll go when the majority is smaller. Will MPs be more disciplined or will they be more reckless? I think the answer is both. Some will go one way, some the other. So they had an initial vote on this glorification issue, this very hard to define. What does glorifying mean, and would it mean that next time you'd get some saintly figure like Nelson Mandela? If you say, what a good bloke Mr. Mandela is standing up to apartheid, that's the issue in a nutshell. Some Labour MPs said Mrs. Blair would have been arrested under this list for saying she understood why Palestinians, desperation resorted to suicide bombing. So that one got them down to 1, and then we had Mr. Winnick, whom you saw in the film, saying 28 days, not 90, it's an old-fashioned compromise, and they had to back down and say, leave it to us, Mr. Winnick, we'll fix something before next week. And that's what they'll do. They'll come up 28, 40, 30.
George, there was a certain amount of confusion when the Prime Minister said, well, maybe there won't be a compromise. I mean, is the government going to compromise next week or not?
Well, it's going to have to compromise. If it doesn't compromise, it'll be defeated. And I think a defeat on this issue would send out, as Tony Blair emphasises, a wrong signal. But I think Tony Blair is equally determined to put across and say, if we get only 28 days, it is because of the Conservatives, it's because of the Liberal Democrats, it's because of the Labour rebels, it's not because of me. And then, if there is a repeat of the 7/7 bombings in London, he will be able to say, we have weaker terrorist measures than I'd want because of these MPs. But I'm not quite sure that's an argument that will wash. And I think if you listen to everything Charles Clarke, the Home Secretary, has said, he doesn't seem to think there's a hope in hell of getting 90 days through. He doesn't seem to believe it himself, but Tony Blair's determined. It's a bit like what happened before on Iraq and weapons of mass destruction. Tony Blair's got this idea into his head. He says the police, security services want it. What they want, they must have.
This is the problem, Tony Blair, using events like July the 7th to justify these laws. It's exactly what the Conservatives were saying. You can't do these knee-jerk reactions. If we got certain laws in place after September the 11th, they were good enough then. So why do we need to do this now? And this whole argument about the 90 days, there's not that many MPs were actually planning to support it. I mean, most of them say maybe a slight extension, but to 3 months, it's incredible, and not many people are going to go for that. And I think they've smelled blood now.
So the government's on the defensive over terror. The Prime Minister's lost Blunkett. I mean, Michael, how damaged is he at the moment? Give us a sort of status report. What would the doctor say?
Well, I saw him on Friday for an interview with for The Guardian. He addresses Labour backbenchers and activists through The Guardian. The Telegraph tends to get the Conservative leaders for the same reason. And, you wonder about Tony Blair. He had a cold, but after about 5 minutes of getting stuck in, he was the old Tony Blair. And he said an interesting thing. He said, the mistake we made over student tuition fees was we did them too late in the Parliament, and it came to the election and the Tories and the Liberals promised to repeal them, although interestingly since the election they've both changed their mind. And he said that famous remark at the conference, I regret not going further sooner, and all the things we're doing are working, and got to get it done early. So he's still a conviction politician. I agree with the colleagues that he wants to go for this 90 days. The trouble is, and I'm not sure he's quite as cynical as George suggested. The trouble is they won't let him, because if he gets in the Commons, get through the Commons, the Lords won't let him. I spoke to a senior Labour peer the other day, a lawyer, who said, I don't know why they need it. If they want to detain people, they can go to a judge and get renewed detention every 7 days. I'm absolutely baffled.
But isn't the broader point that if you scratch many Labour MPs now, they say, look, this man is detached from his party, he's pushing the accelerator button too much on his reforms, he's an old man in a hurry here, this is getting dangerous. And they're concerned about that, George, aren't they?
Well, they are, and the media world, the Westminster Village, is always writing. You saw the headlines back there in the introductory film. Authority, it's that word. Tony Blair likes to use the respect word. The word that's now being used about him is authority. They're all saying he is losing authority. And it's one of those things that I think once it's said often enough, a bit like John Major after Black Wednesday, and the Tory party, once you're seen as a weakened Prime Minister, that your authority is being challenged, it's very difficult to reassert it. And of course, he faces a rebuff on the terror bill, and then he faces further rebellions on things like incapacity benefit, on education, on health, and this is going to go on.
George, it says John Major analogy. Blair, whatever else he is not John Major. And John Major capitulated. Blair fights. He loses, but he fights.
And some people say he's actually more Thatcher, just losing a sense of perspective and proportion.
I think for too long he's had these people really, really close to him, whispering in his ear, telling him, oh no, this Tony, that Tony, and he's not actually listening to the people on the ground. Yeah. He probably ought to listen a little bit more to his own backbenchers. I mean, I was talking to one backbencher this week, and there's already talk about if they try to push through these education reforms next year, that there could be a challenge just to spark the debate. So it's something which he needs to look out for. I mean, they've given him a bloody nose, they've warned him, and so I think he's going to have to listen, and he's going to have to compromise.
He'll have to have certainly a box of tissues. Amid all the controversy surrounding the government, it's been easy to forget that the Conservatives too are in a certain state of flux. Their leadership contest rumbles on as ever, and this week the two candidates came together for a pretty unique political event. The only question, of course, was who won.
The ballot papers are being sent out today. Tory members have just a few weeks now to decide who they want to be their leader. Last night's question time debate may have helped some make up their minds. It began with handshakes and smiles, but later exchanges became more heated. David Davis went on the attack, accusing his rival of aping Tony Blair and being more interested in spin than substance.
The era of spin's coming to an end. And so, frankly, David, that at this point in time, this is absolutely the worst moment for the Conservative Party to imitate Tony Blair.
David Davis presented himself as the man with more experience and more specific policies. But Mr Cameron hit back, saying the Tories shouldn't make promises on tax they might not be able to keep.
Don't make the mistake of trying to set out every day in this leadership campaign policies that will make us look ridiculous in 5 years' time.
So, who got the better of the duel? The Davis team were confident they'd won on points, but neither side landed a knockout blow. This morning, David Cameron wanted to reinforce his broad appeal at an event with non-Conservative supporters.
No, I thought it was a great debate. I think it's brilliant, actually, to do on live television a debate about policy, a debate about the future of the country.
I quite like to come from behind on these things, and I think that the next 3, 4, 5 weeks are going to have the Tory party make a decision on who's going to be the next Tory Prime Minister, and that's a very serious issue. It's not one to be made on a single day's outing.
So, George Jones, who won this debate?
Well, I think the Davis camp are right to claim that they won it on points. I mean, what was important was David Davis went into that debate as the underdog, with everybody saying, David Cameron was going to sweep the board. He actually breathed new life into his leadership campaign. He demonstrated that there is something to be said for experience. He was much better at David Cameron, for example, at trading the low blows below the belt. I mean, something which politicians have to do. They have to do across the dispatch box at the House of Commons. And I think this experience line did play well there, and he did manage, I think, to make David Cameron look, yes, David Cameron's young, he's fresh, he's polished, but he looked a bit inexperienced, and David Cameron, I think, looked a bit nervous as well. So in the end, what we see now is something which is going to be a closer contest, and I think a number of those Tories who are getting those ballot papers, who might have automatically thought, I'll put the cross to Cameron, may now switch and put it to Davis, but at least it's just brought it back to life again.
And do you accept that it will actually change things?
Possibly, but you see, the thing is, I mean, David Davis did quite well last night, but he set the bar so low after, you know, the lacklustre conference speech. You know, he had like an awful lot to prove, but he was literally coming from down here. David Cameron was starting from a very, very high point. And, you know, it's possible that some people watched and thought, oh, actually, yeah, we forgot, you know, David Davis is okay. You know, there's been a lot of, you know, bad press about him maybe. But, you know, yeah, maybe we do need someone with a little bit more experience. And frankly, watching that, you could look at David Cameron, he looked a little bit nervous maybe. And David Davis, obviously been trained, he knew he'd got to go out there and really, really do something quite good. And he did okay. So it's a possibility that some people have been swayed.
But not enough to change the terms of trade, Mike White?
Probably not. Two things. One is debate on British television between contenders is interesting, and I suspect they've created something which will produce finally a prime ministerial debate between leaders of the opposition parties come an election. So it looked interesting and promising. Davis is in the position with the underdog. In a way, that always suits you. It's rather like being Dame Kelly, you come in from behind. So that was better of him. Frankly, I thought the conference speech made by David Cameron wasn't that good, and Davis wasn't that bad. Actually, Liam Fox made the most interesting speech in many ways. So the media hype which surrounded Cameron, maybe that's a bit deflated, and that must be a good thing. On balance, I think Cameron... Davis had more policy last night. I say that. I was stuck on a train in Lincolnshire, so this is second-hand. But the people I consult, like George, say that Davis was solider on policy, but he still can't get the high notes. He's still a bit clunky. Yeah. Whereas you end up with Cameron, he's a gamble, but he represents youth and hope, and he has the possibility to grow into the job.
Yeah, and I thought the interesting thing, David Cameron too, was under pressure there, probably the most under pressure that he's been in this contest, but he stuck his ground. I mean, he said, you know, he wasn't going to make promises on tax. He wasn't going to follow David Davis. In a way, David Davis was sort of tickling the erogenous zones of the Conservative Party on Europe, on drugs.
He's moved back to the right, hasn't he?
He's moved back to the right, yes. I mean, whereas he said he was, you know, going to unify the party, have this ministry of all the talents, he's lost, or people like David Willett's, significant sort of Conservative figures from the centre-left who'd come to support David Davis, have been very worried by some of the things that he's been saying. So I thought, in a way, Cameron pitched his appeal more to the country rather than the Tory party. But of course, the people who are going to have the vote are going to be Conservative Party activists, not the people sitting around here.
Exactly.
Tory Cameronite said to me, the really interesting thing about the activists, they're elderly, they're rather right-wing, but they know that elections are won in the centre, and they know the party mustn't be as right-wing as that's what all the research says, my friend said, that they know they've got to move back towards the centre ground. And as for David Davis, we know why he appeals to the right. As George says, they're the voters, except that with this, that the Cameronians said it took William Hague a year to push back into the right. It's only taken David Davis 3 weeks of bad opinion polls. He's back in the right. It's not where we've got to go. We've got to go the other way. Fight Blair for the centre.
Very quickly, votes go out pretty soon. The ballot papers, you know, but the Tory party will be deciding this next week. Will it all be over this week, very quickly?
No, it won't be over this week. It'll take maybe over in 2 weeks. So some more of these debates to come.
The Hustings matter.
Yeah.
Excellent, great.
We love a contest.
We all do indeed. We love a contest here at Westminster, and certainly here at Straight Talk. That's all for this week. I'm afraid my thanks to George Jones, Anne Alexander and Michael White. We'll be back next week for some more Straight Talk. But for now, goodbye.
Good morning. Well, if you had a bit of a wet Friday, I think you're not going to like what I'm going to tell you next, which is we're going to see more rain this weekend, some quite heavy rain, in fact, at times, although there will be some brighter interludes as well. But through the night, although this weather front hasn't come in just yet for most of us, it's actually turned pretty quiet and quite clear, which means it's also turned rather cold. And so first thing this morning, don't be too surprised if it's feeling on the decidedly chilly side, particularly for central and eastern parts of the UK. today. Further west, we've got a weather front approaching, so the thicker cloud means it's less cold here. But the rain will move in across Northern Ireland this morning, and then later in the morning getting in through Scotland as well as western parts of England and Wales. But then it's really through England and Wales where that rain will stay put through much of the day. In fact, across Scotland, it should cheer up quite nicely through the afternoon, particularly further west. I think it'll still take a while before the rain clears away from the far northeast. But for here in the west and for Northern Ireland, it should actually be a pleasant end of the day. A little breezy, but still sunny. Perhaps a little bit of sunshine creeping in towards Anglesey and through Cardigan Bay late in the afternoon. But for much of England and Wales, it is going to be a wet end to the day. And quite a strong breeze across the south coast, again, particularly in the southwest, just as the heavy rain moves through. But it does mean as well that it's looking as if it's going to be quite a wet night for bonfire celebrations, I'm afraid, particularly through southern parts of England and maybe South Wales as well, until later in the evening. Further north, it should be dry and quite clear, and perhaps turning a little cold once again. So through the evening, the rain will clear away from the southeast eventually, but more heavy rain comes in from the west. Now, some of this rain is really going to be quite heavy. So across Wales and the southwest of England, we are quite concerned about the amount of rain that is going to fall onto already sodden ground. That, of course, increases the risk of flooding. So if you do want to take down the floodlight number, it's 0845 988 1188. Just keep it in hand, just in case. Now, the rain stays across much of England and Wales through Sunday. It does dry up elsewhere, so we will see some brighter skies across Scotland and Northern Ireland, and eventually so across England, but not until the weekend's over and the clock strikes Monday morning. As the rain fades away, it should be a bright start for most of us, but rain later in the west. Bye-bye.
This week in Talking Movies, Disney takes a gamble with the computer animation Chicken Little, and Innocent Voices, a childhood in El Salvador in the midst of civil war.
It's good to be back, catching up with old friends.
Are you with me?
Rome, epic new drama, continues Wednesday at 9 on BBC Two.
Taking to the streets, protesters clash with police in Argentina, unhappy about US proposals over free trade. Police in France say they've arrested more than 30 people in further riots in and around Paris. Pakistan's appeal to the world: don't turn away from the millions left homeless by last month's earthquake. And a royal visit to New Orleans. The Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall see the recovery effort after Hurricane Katrina. Hello and thanks for choosing BBC News. I'm Alistair Yates. Thousands of people have demonstrated against President Bush and his trade proposals for the Americas at a summit of American leaders in Argentina. One protest turned violent as rioters smashed shops and set fire to a bank. From Argentina, the BBC's Steve Kingston reports.
Once again, an international summit has become a target for violence, triggered by the mere presence of George Bush. For a time, the streets of this usually quiet seaside town were taken over by rioters, who destroyed shops, set fire to a bank, and attacked the police. Officers responded with tear gas. There were dozens of arrests. The rioting followed a day of mostly peaceful protest, but even here there was deeply felt anger. Because of Iraq, many of these people call Mr. Bush a murderer. Before the trouble, the president had joked about the security issue at a press conference with his Argentine counterpart.
So I want to thank you for being a good host. It's not easy to host all these countries, particularly not easy to host perhaps me.
Another guest is proving much more popular. Tens of thousands packed a football stadium to hear Venezuela's President Hugo Chavez, who insists Washington is planning an invasion of his country. Teaming up with Diego Maradona, Mr. Chavez promised to bury the proposed free trade area of the Americas, which Mr. Bush supports.
Each of us brought a shovel here, a grave digger's shovel, because the grave of this free trade area is here in Mar del Plata.
Inside the summit, the two presidents were kept apart, but Mr. Bush had to sit through an uncomfortable lecture from his Argentine host, Néstor Kirchner. He said past economic policies recommended by Washington had failed Latin America. So, tensions between the leaders and violence on the streets. This is not a happy summit, and there's still a second day to go. Steve Kingston, BBC News, Mar del Plata, Argentina.
And earlier I spoke to Steve, and he said the rioting had now eased.
It appears that they've calmed down. That's what the police are saying. They made in all between 60 and 70 arrests after these scenes of youths throwing rocks, attacking shop fronts, setting fire to a bank, and the police responding with tear gas. So between 60 and 70 arrests. The police authorities here in Mar del Plata say the situation has calmed down, but there's still an anxious 24 hours or so ahead until this summit ends and the various leaders depart.
And as far as the summit goes and the talks there, how are things progressing?
Well, interestingly, in the opening ceremony, President Bush had to sit through what really amounted to a lecture from his host, the Argentine President Néstor Kirchner, who attacked very, very strongly the economic policies, free market economic policies, which were recommended to Latin America in the 1990s by economists in Washington. Many people in this region feel that those policies haven't worked, they haven't eased poverty, they haven't created jobs, and Néstor Kirchner went as far as to say that they were a failure. Mr. Bush sat tight-lipped, not looking particularly happy, although there have been more smiles here this evening in the official summit side of things, an official dinner for all of the leaders.
So Steve, some of those comments then, the very reason why we're seeing these pictures of people out on the streets then with these burning cars, is that sort of feeling widespread then throughout the Americas, that this whole idea of a free trade is not what they want?
No, I think we have to be careful. I mean, a lot of people in Latin America are unhappy about the war in Iraq, but there are many countries that are very favourable to the idea of a free trade area of the Americas. And you have to remember that the United States is, for most of these other countries, the single biggest trade partner. The US already has trade deals with Chile, for example. It's just signed one with a lot of Central American countries. And there are other countries in the Andean region, for example, who are very keen to get a piece of the action as they see it in terms of trade with Washington. So although Mr. Chavez is, in his own way, frothing at the mouth about this issue, there is not universal support of him. It would be wrong to suggest that there was.
The BBC's Steve Kingston reporting there. Police in France say they've arrested more than 30 people in further riots in and around Paris. Nearly 100 cars have been burned in the latest unrest, the 9th consecutive night of disturbances involving police and youths of mainly African origin. Trouble has also been reported in other cities, including Marseille and Dijon.
Just a few cars, but growing unease. This is Dijon in eastern France. It was the same in Marseille and Normandy. What Paris has grown used to has moved to new towns. And back in the capital, the unrest was into its second week. Fewer confrontations, the police said, but businesses and hundreds of vehicles were set on fire. People first took to the streets because 2 teenagers died. They do it now for a host of reasons, but their main weapon is arson. So in Saint-Denis, these children are becoming used to riot police. Hamoudi Hateli runs this community centre and says there is genuine anger. People want respect, he says. Economic and social difficulties with insults on top. It's too much. What is happening here in the banlieue and now in other towns is raising some uncomfortable questions for France about integration, about how deep the racial divide is, about why a generation of young immigrant men is so angry. And it's here those questions are getting louder. The government had another round of emergency meetings today, but some MPs say any change has to be on all sides.
France has got to do some work and the immigrant population has got to do some work, and that's why I'm saying that the solution is a clear goal of what we want France to be. The question today is that we're talking about integration, but we are never telling what we want people to integrate to.
The issues here are long-term, but the crisis is right now, and with every night and every new area, it gets worse. Richard Bilton, BBC News, Paris.
The UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan has decided to postpone a scheduled trip to Iran after the Iranian president called for Israel to be wiped off the map. Mr. Annan had been due to stop in Iran as part of a Middle East tour which is beginning next week. Last week's remarks by the Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad have drawn international condemnation. A senior British Army officer has repeated allegations that sophisticated bomb-making technology is entering southern Iraq from Iran and providing insurgents with a greater capacity to attack foreign soldiers. Major General Jim Dutton, who commands the multinational forces in southeastern Iraq, said examples of a new type of bomb had been intercepted on their way from Iran in August. Senators in the United States have thrown their support behind plans to introduce legislation outlawing the torture of prisoners. Lawmakers have passed an amendment prohibiting cruel and inhumane treatment of persons in U.S. detention. Senator John McCain says a blanket ban must be applied, ruling out an exemption for the CIA, which has recently been accused of operating secret prison camps in Eastern Europe. It's 1 month since Pakistan's devastating earthquake, and the country's president has criticized rich countries for not doing enough when help is still desperately needed. President Pervez Musharraf told the BBC the West hadn't responded as generously as it did after the tsunami because their own people hadn't been caught up in the quake.
From up here, it looks so neat, so tidy. It's as if the aid operation had turned chaos into order. But on the ground, every pile of rubble is a reminder of this country's worst ever disaster. The figures tell their own story. Over 70,000 dead, a similar number injured, and over 3 million homeless. 4 weeks on, the aid operation is in full swing. This camp, run by Oxfam and the local charity Sangi, is one of hundreds around the country.
Our volunteers have climbed up into the mountains and find out what the people there need, and we gave them aid vouchers.
Every day, about 250 families get tents, blankets and enough food for a month. But they are the ones who've come down into the valleys. Every disaster has somewhere that comes to symbolize the suffering, and Blunkett is one such place. But if this was the scene of the immediate crisis, the problem now has shifted. It's up there in the mountains, where any time now the weather is going to close in, leaving tens of thousands of people trapped without any real shelter for the winter. We set off up the mountain road. Just 5 miles out of town, it's fallen away, reduced to half its normal width. Locals say winter's rain and frost will make the journey even more treacherous. Now, if you look over my shoulder, you'll see a perfect example of why this relief operation is just so challenging. That's a landslide. It's happening now, 3 to 4 weeks after the earthquake. Halfway up the Karakoram range, the order we saw in the tented camps is all but gone. Some of the smaller charities and the Pakistani military come up here and pass out what they've got on the roadside. Well, this is as far as you can come by road. From this point on, the people have got to unload their tents, their food from the trucks, get it onto a mule and walk it up the mountain, or the only other alternative is to wait up there and wait for the relief agencies to bring the stuff to you on a helicopter. And that is where the RAF's Chinooks come in. We travelled with the men of 27 Squadron on their mission of mercy to the remote Ally region. Machines built for war, now in the service of peace. They make 3, sometimes 4 sorties a day. Each flight costs about £13,000 an hour, making this one of the most expensive aid operations ever. The tents and bedding delivered this time represent a lifeline for the village of Pokal. And people are already talking about what happens next, about how they rebuild their village. 4 weeks ago, this was the first and only primary school for girls in the area. The one classroom left standing is a tragedy waiting to happen. So far, the cost of this earthquake has been measured in lives lost and in homes damaged. But how do you calculate the cost of this, the loss of a classroom? If it's the physical damage that catches the eye now, in the long run it'll be the human tragedy that leaves a more permanent mark on people's lives. You see, the full story of this earthquake is a long way from being told. 3 brothers, 3 orphans. Who knows how Itasham, Azkar and Awais will emerge from this long night of a mountain winter. It's not their home or their village that needs rebuilding, it's their lives.
That was George Anagaya reporting from Muzaffarabad. Still ahead on the programme for you, Green Machines, a special report on how California's high-tech cars could help to combat climate change. A British court has found a father and his 2 teenage sons guilty of murdering a student in a so-called honour killing. The court in Oxford, in the south of England, heard that 19-year-old Arash Kobani Zarin was stabbed 46 times because his pregnant girlfriend's family believed their relationship was shameful. Robert Hall reports from the court.
Excuse me, please.
They have lost a son who, in the words of the prosecution, had no enemy in the world. Arash Kobani Zarin died because he had fallen in love with a girl whose family disapproved of him. Late one November night last year, 2 patrolling police officers stopped to check a car parked outside these garages in Oxford's outer suburbs. Inside, they found Mr. Kobani Zarin's body tied to the driver's seat. He'd been stabbed 46 times. 3 days later, witnesses saw a man throw a plastic bag onto nearby allotments. It contained a blood-stained top, cap and gloves, together with the murder weapon, blunted by the savagery of the attack. Forensic evidence that helped link the murder to Chomia Ali, father of the victim's girlfriend, and to his sons Muji on the left, then aged 18, and 15-year-old Mamnoor. CCTV footage helped place Muji near the murder scene. He'd restrained their victim whilst his younger brother carried out the stabbing. Police established that their sister, who was pregnant, had continued her relationship with Mr. Kobani Zarin against the wishes of her family, who intended an arranged marriage.
The male members of the family disliked that particular relationship. The reputation, the honour of the family needs to be upheld. I would say that I do not personally like the label honour. There's no such thing as any honour in killing.
Mr. Kobani Zarin's family and friends applauded when the verdict was delivered.
Justice has been done.
Just describe Arash for me.
Fantastic. My nephew. A very nice young man, intelligent, witty.
They devastated their own family by doing what they did in a moment of madness. God knows what went through their mind.
The 3 accused showed no emotion as the verdicts were given. Tonight, the parents of their victim said they missed the 19-year-old every second, every minute and every hour of every day. His death, they said, had crushed their family.
And these are the headlines. Riot police have clashed with protesters in Argentina, where the Summit of the Americas is being held. Demonstrators are unhappy about US proposals on free trade. Police in France say they've arrested more than 30 people in further riots in and around Paris. Nearly 100 cars have been burnt in the latest attacks. 4 weeks since Pakistan's devastating earthquake, the country's president has criticized rich countries for not doing enough to help. 2 men have appeared in court in London charged with plotting a terrorist bomb attack in Britain. Wasim Mughal and Yunus Suli were remanded in custody. A 3rd man was also remanded, charged in connection with an alleged terrorist fundraising.
They came to court under police escort, accused of planning a terrorist attack in the UK. One, a 19-year-old, Tariq Al-Dor from Paddington, was charged with credit card and fundraising offences for the purpose of terrorism. The other 2 are accused of conspiracy to murder and conspiracy to cause an explosion. These are extremely serious charges. One of the men is Wasim Mughal, who's 22 and from Kent. The charge sheet alleges police searching his bedroom found a DVD entitled Martyrdom Operations Vest. It's alleged they also found pieces of paper with Welcome to Jihad written in Arabic and hospital equals attack. And anti-terrorist officers claim they found a recipe for rocket propellant and guidance on causing an explosion. The second charge with conspiracy to murder and cause an explosion is Eunice Sooley, also 22 from West London. Police allege a search of his bedroom revealed computer images on how to make a car bomb and images of Washington, D.C. Lawyers for the men left court without commenting after hearing the alleged offences relate to activity on a date before the 31st of October 2005. This evening, all three men have been taken to Belmarsh Jail in southeast London. They'll appear in court again on November the 18th. These charges are in no way connected to the attacks in London in July. They relate to a separate alleged conspiracy. The men will now be fast-tracked through the legal system to appear before a higher court, in this case the Old Bailey, in 2 weeks' time. Margaret Gilmore, BBC News at Bow Street Magistrates Court.
Leaders of the Roman Catholic Church in Poland have begun considering evidence for the beatification of the late Pope John Paul II. It's a process that could ultimately lead him to being named a saint.
The ceremonies began with a solemn mass in Krakow Cathedral. It was there almost half a century ago that the Polish-born Pope celebrated one of his first masses as a young priest. Leading the service was John Paul II's former private secretary, Archbishop Stanisław Dziwisz. Afterwards, 5 church officials were sworn in as tribunal members. Their job will be to hear testimony from people who knew the late Pope. The evidence will be given behind closed doors. Even the list of witnesses is private, but the media here have reported around 100 people will testify, including Archbishop Dziwisz. Pope Benedict XVI launched the beatification proceedings in June. He waived the customary 5-year waiting period to start the process, following public calls to name John Paul II a saint as soon as possible. But church leaders here say the procedure will take time and is unlikely to be completed before Benedict's scheduled trip to Poland next June. Adam Easton, BBC News, Warsaw.
The heir to the British throne, Prince Charles, and his new wife, the Duchess of Cornwall, are on the 4th day of their American visit. They wound up the Washington leg of their tour by laying a wreath honouring World War II veterans. Well, now they've arrived in the hurricane-hit city of New Orleans.
Royal visitors walking down empty streets. No onlookers, no one clapping. In New Orleans, Prince Charles and the Duchess of Cornwall were honoured guests in an area all but abandoned by the people who once lived here. This part of the city was one of the worst hit when the levee which protected it from the sea collapsed. The Prince and the Duchess were taken to see the rebuilding work, some of which is being paid for by one of the Prince's charities. They met the soldiers and engineers who've been trying to bring some order to the chaos.
Tell us your reaction so far from what you've seen, sir.
I just said, it's terrifying.
It is terrifying.
We feel deeply for people who've had to suffer so much for so long, and will have to go on.
It's quite humbling, isn't it?
It's very humbling. You have to see it with your own eyes to believe it. Not even the television pictures show you how terrible it is.
What do people say to you, Mum?
Oh, they're wonderful. They're so optimistic.
In another part of the city, a small crowd turned up as Camilla and Charles arrived at a Catholic school, the first one in the city to reopen after Hurricane Katrina. The Duchess will no doubt be taking part in more events like these as she accompanies her husband on official trips around the world. This one, their first, has not sparked great excitement among ordinary Americans. But one of the teachers at the school said, for people who have lost everything, this visit means a lot. Ben Gagan, BBC News.
Volunteers and Navy officers are working around the clock to stop an oil spill off the coast of Chile spreading any further. A Hong Kong tanker crashed into rocks off the Antofagasta coast on Monday, leaving a 7-kilometre trail of oil. While the leak has been contained, it has already caused considerable contamination to the area's animal life. President Bush says new technologies will solve the problem of global warming and insists that market forces will ensure they're widely adopted. But is that the case? Well, in California, politicians are shaping the market to force through new inventions. One beneficiary could be a long-term project to generate hydrogen from bacteria in pond scum.
Come take a ride to the future. These cars may look completely normal, but they're not. They're prototypes, powered by hydrogen fuel cells that make electricity.
This is the fuel cell. We bring air in on one side, hydrogen then comes in on the other side through the injectors.
And magically, the only exhaust is harmless water vapor. Politicians in California have passed a radical law demanding that car makers cut greenhouse gas emissions from cars by a third by 2014. The green flag for green cars is being waved by the right-hand man to California's Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. He thinks the hydrogen revolution will span the United States.
New York has said that they will copy our law to reduce greenhouse gases from cars, and other states are poised to follow suit. So as many environmental issues happen in the United States, we start here in California, and it's a trend that leads the nation.
More than that, California is leading the world with its clean cars law. That'll be a surprise for many. But where does the hydrogen come from?
This fuel is completely clean once it goes into the car, but there is still a problem because most hydrogen at the moment is still being produced from natural gas, which is pumping up climate change. The real trick would be to get hydrogen from renewable sources of energy.
And here's one technology that could help produce hydrogen without using fossil fuels. Solar foil uses the sun to make electricity. The electricity is then used to get hydrogen from water. This firm in Silicon Valley hopes to print solar foil for just 1/10 of its current cost. In the future, it could be a valuable weapon in the battle against climate change. At Stanford University, we've come to see another idea for getting hydrogen. This one is truly extraordinary. The scientists here say they've genetically modified the bacteria in pond scum, so they produce hydrogen. Their results have to be verified yet, but they dream that cars one day may be powered by hydrogen from bacteria. The challenge is huge though, and these biologists say America needs to put as much effort into climate change technology as it did into putting a man on the moon.
We need substantial investment. In fact, somebody compared it to the equivalent of the Apollo program in today's scales, that we need to invest to get to technologies now, because we really need them.
The world is warming, but the politicians in California are full of American optimism that by doing things like cutting emissions from cars, they can solve climate change in time. The scientists are not so sure. Roger Harrabin, BBC News, California.
A collection of John F. Kennedy memorabilia, including some of his most personal possessions, is set to go under the hammer in New York. On sale will be the collection of Robert White. He's a JFK enthusiast who amassed tens of thousands of items related to the former US president. Some of the most fancied items are expected to be a watch worn at his inauguration and a hotline telephone from the White House. Our main point: thousands of people have demonstrated against President Bush and his trade proposals for the Americas. And that's our world news. I'm Alistair Yates.
Hello there. I hope you had a pleasant end to the week, but this weekend it does look as if we're all going to see quite a bit of wet weather. There will be some sunshine around as well. It's not all doom and gloom, but some areas will be at risk of some flooding, so I'll come back to that just a little bit later on. For tonight though, although this weather front is looming across the UK just now, it's actually fairly quiet, and with clear skies tonight it's going to turn pretty chilly as well. So it looks as though it's going to be rather cold, particularly across central and eastern parts of the UK come morning, but further west the cloud will be thicker and we'll also start to see some rain across Northern Ireland, so hence it will be a touch milder here too. But the rain will move away from Northern Ireland through the morning, moving in through Scotland, although it will cheer up here later in the day as well, and also moving in across England and Wales to give a pretty wet old afternoon, and there will be some heavy bursts of rain tucked in here as well. Now across Scotland, although the remnants of the rain will linger in the far northeast, it'll certainly be very pleasant across the western side of the country. Here, in spite of the breeze, the sunshine will make it feel quite pleasant, and similarly so for Northern Ireland. Again, a breeze but sunny through the latter part of the day. It should also cheer up a touch across Anglesey and maybe through Cardigan Bay before evening, but in general Wales and England will stay pretty wet, and there will be some heavy bursts of rain tucked in there as well. By mid-afternoon the rain will also have got going across East Anglia and the southeast, and it is going to stay put really through much of the evening for most areas across the south in particular. So a bit of a wet bonfire night, I'm afraid, but head further north and it should actually be dry, if rather chilly once again, because the rain is going to fade away from the southeast only slowly during Saturday night. Further north, as you can see, it stays dry until later in the night when more rain heads in from the west, and this rain looks as if it's going to be pretty heavy, particularly across parts of Wales and the southwest of England, for example, where here we're quite concerned about the amount of rain that's going to fall. There is going to be the risk of further flooding, so if you want, take a note of the floodline number. It's 0845 988 1188. Just keep it handy just in case. Now the rain will stay across England and Wales through much of the day on Sunday, although slowly it'll begin to fade away from Scotland. So here and for Northern Ireland it should end up being dry to end off the weekend, but the rain will ease away during Sunday evening and overnight, and then it turns quite dry again. So perhaps a bright start to Monday morning for many of us, but more rain heads in from the west, so it stays unsettled for a little while yet. Bye-bye.
Okay, new series of the late edition, new brand positioning. Let's think out of the box. If it were a sound, what sound would it be?
It's an orgasmic sizzle.
Like it. If it were a dream, what kind of dream would it be?
Jordan, on a bouncy castle.
Can we just stick with the late edition? It's really funny.
Yeah, very good.
The late edition, Thursday at 10:30 on BBC 4.
is beginning to irritate me. We shall take control of it too.
Egypt. The search continues tomorrow at 9 on BBC One.
I'm Alistair Yates with BBC News. Riot police have clashed with anti-American demonstrators in Argentina at the opening of the Americas Summit. Officers used tear gas when rioters began attacking buildings. Police in France say they've arrested more than 30 people in further riots in and around Paris. It's the 9th consecutive night of disturbances involving police and youths of mainly African origin. Pakistan's President Pervez Musharraf says the West hasn't given enough to help his country recover from the earthquake. He claims Pakistan hasn't received the level of aid given after Hurricane Katrina or the tsunami. Prince Charles and the Duchess of Cornwall are in New Orleans on the latest stop of their US tour. They met survivors and emergency workers during a brief visit. It's the 4th day of their US tour. The UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan has decided to postpone a scheduled trip to Iran after the Iranian president called for Israel to be wiped off the map. Mr. Annan had been due to stop in Iran as part of a Middle East tour, which is beginning next week. Last week's remarks by the Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, have drawn international condemnation. A senior British Army officer has repeated allegations that sophisticated bomb-making technology is entering southern Iraq from Iran and providing insurgents with a greater capacity to attack foreign soldiers. Major General Jim Dutton, who commands the multinational forces in southeastern Iraq, said examples of a new type of bomb had been intercepted on their way from Iran in August. Senators in the United States have thrown their support behind plans to introduce legislation outlawing the torture of prisoners. Lawmakers have passed an amendment prohibiting cruel and inhumane treatment of persons in U.S. detention. Senator John McCain says a blanket ban must be applied, ruling out an exemption for the CIA, which has recently been accused of operating secret prison camps in Eastern Europe. Anti-government protests in Ethiopia have spread to a string of towns which voted for the opposition in May's bitterly contested elections. The capital, Addis Ababa, is tense but calm after days of violent demonstrations which left more than 40 dead. Many people are now remaining at home, and an almost total strike by the city's taxi drivers is in place. The chairman of the African Union, President Obasanjo of Nigeria, has been having talks in Ivory Coast to try to secure agreement on a new prime minister for the divided country. He said he'd spoken with all parties and asked them to make recommendations about who they wanted to nominate for the post. Mr. Obasanjo said a decision would be made in the coming days or weeks. The first fox hunting season since the government banned hunting with dogs gets underway this morning. The League Against Cruel Sports claims 40% of hunts since the ban was introduced in February have broken the law. But the Countryside Alliance says a new poll shows support for the ban is at an all-time low, and it's determined hunts will keep going. Well, Bonfire Night will be celebrated throughout the United Kingdom tonight, marking the 400th anniversary of the foiled gunpowder plot. In 1605, Guy Fawkes and his band of 12 young Catholic men attempted to blow up the Houses of Parliament and destroy the monarchy. Computer graphics now reveal what would have happened if the plot had succeeded. Well, that's our news. It's 5:33. More news, of course, coming up at 6 o'clock for you. Well, now on BBC News 24, it's Talking Movies.
Hello from New York, I'm Tom Brooke. In today's programme, filmmaker Sam Mendes makes a foray into the war movie with Jarhead. Disney takes a big gamble with Chicken Little, and Innocent Voices, a powerful vision of civil strife in El Salvador in the 1980s, seen through the eyes of a young boy. All that and more in this edition of Talking Movies.
Talking Movies. Talking Movies. Talking Movies.
6 years ago, British theatre director Sam Mendes made a very impressive entree into filmmaking with American Beauty, a satire and drama that looked at one suburban American family and what was going on beneath the surface. But it's not the family that Mendes takes on in his latest picture, Jarhead. It's another cherished American institution, the US Marines.
You will repeat after me. This is my rifle.
This is my rifle. Based on the bestseller by Anthony Swofford, Jarhead is the story of a group of US Marines who spent 5 months in the Saudi Arabian desert in the Gulf War in the early 1990s. Swofford was there. In the film, he's portrayed by Jake Gyllenhaal. We witness a man whose soul is forever changed by being trained how to become a killing machine by his possession of a rifle.
Without me, my rifle is nothing.
Without me, my rifle is nothing. For Swofford, this film accurately captured his experiences.
Yeah, it's very realistic. When I sit down and watch the film, you know, I'm reliving those events. When Jake is on the sniper line with a rifle on his shoulder and he pulls the trigger, like that's what the rifle sounded like. Action.
For Sam Mendes, Jarhead is a departure from more staged films like American Beauty and Road to Perdition. This picture is about the chaos of life in a combat zone. For Mendes, it was an adventure. Ask his wife.
Well, all I can tell you is he would come home and just say he was having a great time. I mean, he was very, very happy doing this film and trying lots of new things and not maybe being as composed or as pre-planned as he had been in the past. I mean, a lot of it was improvised in the end.
For Sam Mendes, the images in his film convey reality, more so perhaps than news reports on the Marines back in the early 1990s and in Iraq today.
I would like to say this is a truer picture of the Marine on the ground. And in that sense, it's not just a generic Marine. You know, there are 8 Marines, and they're all completely individual portraits, and they're all there for totally different reasons. And I think one of the things that I was very conscious to try and do is to put human faces to the numbers that we're reading about there every day.
You will train, you will hydrate, and you will maintain a constant state of suspicious alertness.
The focus of the film is on one specific group of soldiers, their humour, camaraderie, mental anguish, their frustration as they wait for active engagement that never happens. It's raw, and you get the sense it's very honest. These men are all things. They're compassionate, they're feeble-minded, they're strong, they're heavily invested in pornography, and they possess a primitive bloodlust. The images of military life that are depicted in the film, they are very much at odds with military recruitment advertising. Why is that?
Well, because there's a gap between the reality of what is being offered in terms of the enticements and the reality, and that's true. That's true because if they were totally honest about what occurs, the alteration that must occur once you join, there would be fewer takers, I imagine.
Is it a political film then?
No, it's a film about war. It's an honest portrayal of guys with boots on the ground and rifles in their hands.
In times of war, a Hollywood studio would, in loyalty to those in harm's way, probably never make a film that in any way critiques an active US military campaign. That only happens after a war, as it did with Vietnam. But in the context of our times, Jarhead could be seen as unpatriotic, because it does detract from the nobility of US troops at war. What do you say to those people who say this is liberal Hollywood making our Marines look less than glorious?
I would say that Hollywood is a kind of concept that I don't fully understand. I mean, this is a book, very particular book, written by a very particular Marine, and I've tried to be as true to that as possible. I also think, as a movie, it doesn't just sort of put the boot in. Do you know what I mean? It actually gives voice in the shape of Jamie Foxx to the figure of the lifer Marine, the guy who believes that this is absolutely what he should be doing, and who even in the depths of hell, turns around and says, "Look at this. Who else gets to see this?" And you know what he's talking about. So it does give voice to both sets of opinions, both points of view, both the cynic and the realist. And I think that was very important to me.
God, show me the way because the devil's trying to break me down.
Enough of the politics, what about the artistry? This film has an adventurous visual style. Through use of a handheld camera, it has a cinema verite feel, but it always remains a story told through one individual's point of view.
The sniper dies for that one perfect shot.
It may sound like a put-down, it's not intended that way, but Jarhead as a film isn't as original as another Gulf War picture, David O. Russell's Three Kings, a cockeyed view of the war that was more compelling and entertaining. It also made a political point that the US had ended up unfairly abandoning those Iraqis it had urged to rise up against Saddam Hussein.
I walk through the valley of the shadow where death is.
The first words that entered my head after I left a screening of Jarhead were that this film was curiously emotionally unengaging. The film has a challenge which it never really overcomes. How do you make an exciting drama about a group of Marines sitting around frustrated, waiting for active combat that never happens? The acting from Gyllenhaal, Jamie Foxx and Peter Sarsgaard is good, but at the end of this picture you're left feeling, so what?
Come over to the dark side.
It doesn't really give you much to chew on, other than to remind you that life in the military can be very, very tough. The rapper 50 Cent is a huge, huge star in the world of American hip-hop. Jim Sheridan is a modest but very respected Irish filmmaker. These two gents have combined forces to create Get Rich or Die Trying, a picture that marks 50 Cent's feature film debut. It's also a movie that's attracted a bit of controversy. Manoush Somarodi reports.
You the boss, Marcus?
Yeah.
So what do you do?
I'm a gangster.
The rapper 50 Cent says that 75% of his film, Get Rich or Die Tryin', is autobiographical. His mother was murdered when he was 8 years old. 50 Cent, whose real name is Curtis Jackson, turned to drug dealing at the age of 12. He was imprisoned as a teenager, and in the year 2000, he was shot 9 times. He survived and went on to become one of the biggest and richest hip-hop stars in America. All of this also happens to Marcus, the character he plays in Get Rich or Die Tryin'.
Give us the cash to come go to the safe, or she don't know it. Damn, okay, we'll wait.
What do you think that they might think about you after people see this film?
They'll understand my motivation. They'll understand why I have the drive to move forward to the next level. And, you know, I don't think ambition is a learned behavior. I think it's a part of a person's character. And they'll understand why I'll keep setting goals, and accomplishing them is what's going to truly make me happy.
So you were with it? Yeah, 50, you just come out and you're looking at Bam at your car.
Oddly, this film about the tough black neighborhoods of the Bronx comes from Irish director Jim Sheridan. A 6-time Oscar nominee, Sheridan is best known for his films My Left Foot and In America. But Sheridan says he and 50 Cent have more in common than you might think.
I like the rap music, you know, I've always liked it, and I'm fascinated with that world. And you know, when I met 50, it was like meeting somebody I'd known all my life, because I come from an area that's tough, where there was drugs, you know, where there were gangsters. I kind of was in a band, I was a singer, I liked narrative songs, so I understood it very well.
But already this film has gotten attention for supposedly glamorizing violence. Paramount Pictures removed promotional posters for Get Rich or Die Tryin' after Californian community leaders complained about the image of 50 Cent holding out a microphone and a gun.
Why do you think they're picking on you? This is certainly not the first time we've seen guns on movie posters.
There's been 18 films released this year where people have held weapons in the advertisement for the film, and 4 of them have been law enforcement. No one had a problem with any of them but 50 Cent.
So some may not approve of 50 Cent, but it's safe to assume that his movie will do well amongst hip-hop fans. It may also do well with broader audiences. 3 years ago, rapper Eminem's film 8 Mile proved that a biographical picture about a rapper can have crossover potential. But although his film received critical praise and did well at the box office, Eminem has yet to make another movie. Will the same thing happen to 50 Cent?
There's a possibility for me to do a new film if I find a screenplay that's as exciting to me as my life story. All right, let's do it again.
Disney has a lot riding on the success of its adaptation of Chicken Little, a well-known cautionary American fable. It's the studio's first venture into computer-generated animation in what are trying times for the company. Damien Fowler has been looking at Chicken Little's state-of-the-art animation and why its box office performance is so important for Disney.
This is a high-tech version of the classic children's story of Chicken Little, who mistakenly believes the sky is falling in when an acorn hits his head. But that's where the similarity to the fairy tale ends.
A piece of the sky? Not again!
This time the sky really is falling, goes the Disney tagline. And soon, all hell breaks loose on screen, thanks to the lavish CGI, computer-generated imagery, that gets unleashed in this film.
Come on, Dad. We've got a planet to save.
Rock me a little hippie, boy.
The animation is so crisp and clear, and at times it almost looks like they filmed real elements and put them in. It is so realistic.
They're making a movie.
Disney's got a lot invested in the success of this film, and not just financially. It built its fortune on classics like Snow White, Cinderella, and more recent hits like The Lion King. Now it hopes that Chicken Little will revive a golden age of animation for the studio. Chicken Little is an important transition for the studio, away from the traditional techniques that Walt Disney himself pioneered.
Disney is in need of a big hit film. They do have Chronicles of Narnia coming at Christmas, but that's a different type of film. This film in computer animation is important because it establishes them in the new genre of CGI.
Disney is looking to the future, but it has a lot of catching up to do. Over the last decade, it's lost ground to competitors like DreamWorks, the studio that produced blockbuster hits like Shrek and Shrek 2. And for more than 10 years, Disney has benefited from a distribution and profit-sharing deal with Pixar, a pioneer of computer-animated movies, which created smash hits like Toy Story, Monsters, Inc. and The Incredibles. After a tense disagreement last year, the two studios are now in talks again. So, if Chicken Little is a hit, Disney will be less dependent on Pixar for crucial new characters.
There's no doubt that they feel is their rightful position as the leading animation company, basically with stories and technology that is second to none. And that's what they are really pursuing here at a fervid pace.
I am the champion. Given everything that's at stake, executives in Hollywood will no doubt be watching Chicken Little carefully, but not necessarily to find out if the sky really does fall in.
Innocent Voices is, by all accounts, a powerful vision of civil strife in El Salvador in the 1980s, seen through the eyes of a young boy. It's made by a Mexican director who's pursued a Hollywood career. But for him, it's different, quite heartfelt. Manoush Zamarodi reports.
Civil war engulfed the country of El Salvador from 1980 to 1992. In Innocent Voices, Chava is 11 years old. He's played by Carlos Padilla Lanero. When he turns 12, Chava runs the risk of being drafted into the Salvadoran army.
Van a defender a la patria. Sargento, vámonos.
Chava's father has abandoned his children and young wife, played by Leonor Varela. They have been left alone to survive, caught between the crossfire of the armed guerrilla rebels and the right-wing government. This is the true story of Oscar Torres, and Innocent Voices is told from his point of view as a child growing up in El Salvador.
In terms of actually fearing for your life, was there a point where as a boy you thought that this would be the end for you?
It was, it was almost a daily thing. I mean, it was every time there was a shooting, you thought, that's it, there's a bullet coming for you. Because it happened to so many kids in our town. This is told through the eyes of someone who lived it, and it's also through the eyes of that child completely.
Torres eventually escaped to Los Angeles. 3 years ago, he met Mexican director Luis Mandoki while acting in a commercial there. Torres gave Mandoki his script, and although Mandoki mainly makes Hollywood films, the director felt he could not pass up Innocent Voices, much of which he ended up shooting in his native Mexico.
Well, I am from Mexico, and I left when Hollywood, opened me their doors, and I had the chance of making movies like White Palace, When a Man Loves a Woman, and I was there for 16 years. I made many movies there, but you always have the dream of going back to your roots and doing a movie in your language. I was looking for a story like that. I never expected to get such an amazing story like this.
¿Cómo te llamas?
Temo.
¿Temo qué?
We've seen films before that deal with children and war and the intersection between the two. How would you say that your film attacks that issue differently?
First of all, it shows you a reality that I didn't know myself about it, which is child soldiers. Children being recruited from the age of 8 to armies in the world, not only in El Salvador of the 80s, but today. There's more, there's hundreds of thousands of children in that condition, which is terrible for humankind. And so for me, this movie also captures the contrasts of life, of war and playing, of death and fun, of tragedy and poetry, and in a very unique way.
Innocent Voices may alert cinemagoers to the plight of child soldiers, but can the film have any tangible effects?
The filmmakers say that already Amnesty International is screening Innocent Voices as part of its campaign for the universal ratification and enforcement of international treaties protecting children.
As for whether Innocent Voices works as a piece of cinema, critics generally praise the film for its powerful and wrenching images. But some believe Mandoki is a bit too manipulative in pushing the audience's emotional buttons.
Although many people haven't heard of them, most music aficionados will tell you that the New York Dolls were a seminal rock band of the early 1970s, forerunners of the punk revolution. They inspired the Sex Pistols, the Clash and the Ramones. Now a new documentary looks at the band's history pretty much through the eyes of one of its founding members. For director Greg Whiteley, the sounds of the New York Dolls are most definitely familiar. These musicians were a bold, vibrant force. They looked bizarre. They were originals. They're credited with keeping rock music alive in the early 1970s.
They brought back, in my mind, what I think is fun about rock and roll. What is this, it's not important. It's not played by the best musicians in the world, but they are songs filled with a rigid, rebellious teenage angst. And in the 70s, that was started to be lost. And they brought that back.
He was down and out for a long time.
He was very, very sad.
The documentary's focus is on the group's bassist, Arthur Killer Kane. We see him 30 years after the Dolls broke up. Like some of the other band members, Arthur Killer Kane battled addiction. For him, it was alcoholism. He was a man who encountered misfortune.
I was demoted from rock star to schlep on the bus.
This film begins and ends with the bass player Arthur Killer Kane. He's a guy that history forgot. I mean, after 1975, he just disappeared. There was just no music career for him. He tried to start several bands, but they didn't work out. We find him 30 years later living on Social Security disability, and he's a Mormon. And I just thought, well, this is fascinating. This is a story worth telling. How did a guy that was once the prototypical glam punk rock star become this guy? And that's what our movie's about.
What do you make of Arthur Killer Kane? Because in many ways he's quite admirable and he's quite a soulful man, but he's also quite sad in a way, isn't he?
Yeah, I think he's enigmatic. He sneaks up on you. When you first meet him, you go, boy, this guy is not very bright. He's not all there. And then as you start listening to him and you get to know him, he's actually quite poignant and intelligent and deep. There's times you're with him and you go, my gosh, what a sad person. And then there's other times where he is just so full of optimism and hope. And he seemed to be a radical collision of all kinds of opposites.
Oh, Arthur, I understand you'll be in town playing Marcy's Meltdown Festival this summer.
The film ends with the New York Dolls reunion concert held in London last year. For Arthur Killer Kane, it was a momentous occasion. For years, he'd yearned to get the band back together.
The movie becomes about a guy who dreams and longs for something for 30 years, and he finally gets it, and then I think we just ask the question, well, what happens when he finally gets it? Does it end up being a good thing? Is the reunion successful? What happens to his life after? And to me, that's our movie.
Well, that completes another edition of Talking Movies. Please remember you can always reach us online at our website via bbc.co.uk. So until the next time, from me, Tom Brooke, and the rest of the Talking Movies team here in New York, it's goodbye.
It was a recipe for disaster. Course meal of no siree. It seemed happily ever after. The sky is falling. Happy everyone was after me. It was a cup of good intentions, a tablespoon of one big mess, dash of overreaction. I soon you know the rest. One little slip, one little slip. It was a fusion of confusion with a few confounding things.
Hello there. If you're looking forward to your bonfire celebrations tonight, it might be on the wet side, I'm afraid. We are going to see quite a bit of rain coming through this weekend, but there will be some brighter weather around as well. Now, it has been a chilly night so far, so this morning it's actually looking decidedly on the cool side. Rain, though, heads in through Northern Ireland this morning, clears away pretty quickly, though, before shooting its way through Scotland and into the western side of England and Wales. But I think further south it is going to stay pretty wet through much of the day. In fact, it'll brighten up quite nicely across Scotland and Northern Ireland, and so here it will be a clear afternoon and a clear evening as well for any fireworks. But late afternoon sunshine is on the cards for Western Scotland and for Northern Ireland as well, although it will be a little breezy at times. Perhaps even a little bit of late afternoon sunshine into the far west of Scotland, but elsewhere it's looking as if it's going to be a pretty wet end to the day. Now, some of that rain will be quite heavy, particularly through central parts of England in the mid-afternoon, but the rain will also get going across East Anglia and the southeast too. So across southern parts of England in particular, it is going to be wet for bonfire night, I'm afraid. Further north, looking drier, clearer, and perhaps a little chillier as well, so wrap up warm. But this is roughly where the rain will be at around 6-7 o'clock. It fades away from the southeast late in the evening, but more rain spills up from the southwest. This rain looks as if it's going to be pretty heavy, and certainly for Wales and the southwest of England there is some concern as to how much rain we actually will see, so there is the risk